Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the President of the United States just accomplished something that seemed impossible? What if Donald Trump managed to do what no foreign adversary, no economic crisis, and no geopolitical rival could ever achieve? He turned America's closest ally, its largest trading partner, and the nation with which it shares the world's longest undefended border into an economic and diplomatic adversary actively seeking to escape American influence. Have you ever stopped to consider how quickly a relationship built over centuries can unravel? How a partnership forged in 2 world wars, cemented through NAFTA, and deepened through countless shared institutions could be shattered by the reckless application of tariffs disguised as economic patriotism? This is not a story about trade disputes or diplomatic disagreements. This is the story of how a transactional worldview, when applied to international relations, doesn't just damage relationships, it destroys them permanently. And what makes this moment so historically significant is that we are watching, in real time, the consequences of treating allies like rivals and partnerships like hostile takeovers. The numbers don't lie. The patterns are undeniable. And the geopolitical realignment happening right now will reshape North America for generations. Yet there are powerful forces, financial institutions, political establishments, and media narratives working overtime to obscure what is actually happening. They want you to believe this is normal trade negotiation, routine diplomatic friction, just another chapter in the usual back and forth between neighbors. But once you understand the full scope of what Trump's tariff war has unleashed, once you see the economic devastation it is causing to American workers and the strategic catastrophe it represents for American power, the entire illusion collapses. You begin to see not just a failed policy, but a systematic dismantling of American influence that will take decades to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. Let's begin with what the official narrative wants you to believe. You've been told that Trump's tariffs are about protecting American jobs, bringing back manufacturing, and standing up for the working class against unfair trade practices. The talking points are everywhere. America first, economic nationalism, tough negotiation tactics that will force other countries to give the United States a better deal. On the surface, it sounds reasonable. Who doesn't want to protect American workers? Who doesn't want fair trade? The language is deliberately crafted to appeal to economic anxiety and patriotic sentiment. And for millions of Americans struggling with stagnant wages and disappearing manufacturing jobs, the promise of a president willing to fight for them is deeply compelling. But here's the problem. Your personal experience tells a different story. If you've been to a grocery store recently, you've noticed that prices haven't gone down, they've gone up. If you work in manufacturing, you haven't seen a renaissance of American industry. You've seen supply chain disruptions, factory closures, and layoffs. If you're a farmer, Trump's trade wars haven't opened new markets. They've closed existing ones, forcing you to rely on government bailouts just to survive. The first crack in the narrative appears when you look at who is actually paying for these tariffs. Despite Trump's repeated claims that China, Canada, and Mexico are paying, the reality is simple and irrefutable. Tariffs are taxes on imports, and those taxes are paid by American companies and passed directly to American consumers. When Trump imposes a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, it's not the Canadian steel producer who writes a check to the U.S. Treasury. It's the American manufacturer who buys that steel. And what does that American manufacturer do? They raise prices. The cost flows downstream, landing squarely on the shoulders of ordinary Americans. This brings us to a crucial question that the official narrative cannot answer. If tariffs are designed to help American workers, why are American workers paying more for everything? Why are the costs of cars, construction materials, appliances, and everyday goods climbing while wages remain flat? The math doesn't work. The promise doesn't match the reality. And here's where it gets even more revealing. The tariff strategy isn't just failing economically, it's backfiring diplomatically. Canada, America's single largest trading partner, responsible for more bilateral trade than China, Japan, and Germany combined, is not bending to Trump's pressure. Instead, it is doing something far more consequential. It is walking away. To understand the full scope of this disaster, we need to examine the economic mechanics that Trump either doesn't understand or deliberately ignores. The United States and Canada are not just trading partners. They operate as a deeply integrated economic organism. For decades, industries have been built on the assumption of seamless cross-border commerce. A single automobile manufactured in the United States crosses the Canadian border an average of 7 times before final assembly, with parts and components moving back and forth as they progress through the supply chain. This integration was not an accident. It was the deliberate result of policies designed to maximize efficiency, reduce costs, and create competitive advantages for North American manufacturers against global rivals. NAFTA, and later the USMCA, weren't just trade agreements. They were the architectural foundation of a continental economy that allowed American and Canadian companies to compete globally by leveraging each other's strengths. Trump's tariffs have taken a sledgehammer to this structure. When he imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, claiming national security justifications that were transparently absurd, he didn't just raise costs for American manufacturers. He injected uncertainty and instability into every business decision that relies on cross-border trade. Companies that had invested billions in supply chains optimized for North American integration suddenly found themselves facing unpredictable costs and potential disruptions. The consequences are measurable and devastating. The Yale Budget Lab calculated that Trump's tariffs will push between 650,000 and 875,000 Americans into poverty, not theoretical poverty, real poverty. Families losing their homes, parents unable to feed their children, workers losing their jobs as companies relocate or shut down entirely. These aren't projections based on ideology. They're calculations based on the direct costs that tariffs impose and the cascading effects they trigger throughout the economy. Let's break down what this means for specific workers. A teacher in the American Midwest will lose approximately $490 per year due to higher costs for goods affected by tariffs. A firefighter will lose $470 annually. A police officer will lose $250 per year. These are not wealthy people. These are the working-class Americans that Trump claims to champion, and they are being systematically impoverished by the very policies that were supposed to protect them. Meanwhile, at the top of the economic pyramid, a very different story unfolds. The wealthiest 0.1% of Americans, those earning over $4 million per year, will gain an average of $350,000 annually from Trump's associated tax cuts and policy changes. Not $350, not $3,500, $350,000. This is the trade-off. Nearly 1 million Americans pushed into poverty so that a tiny elite can accumulate even more wealth. This isn't economic nationalism. It's upward redistribution dressed in patriotic language. The tariffs on Canada specifically have triggered a spiral of retaliation that compounds the damage. Canada didn't simply absorb Trump's tariffs and hope for mercy. It responded with precision-targeted counter-tariffs designed to inflict maximum political pain. Canadian tariffs focused on products manufactured in key Republican districts, on agricultural goods from swing states, on industries that employ Trump's core supporters. This isn't random. It's strategic economic warfare designed to create domestic political pressure that forces Trump to back down. But Trump didn't back down. He doubled down. He imposed additional tariffs, expanded the list of targeted goods, and escalated his rhetoric. He even went so far as to suggest that Canada should simply become the 51st state, a proposal so tone-deaf and insulting that it would be laughable if it weren't coming from the President of the United States. This statement alone reveals the depth of Trump's misunderstanding. He views Canada not as a sovereign nation and strategic partner, but as a property to be acquired, a deal to be closed, a transaction to be dominated. The economic damage extends far beyond tariffs themselves. Uncertainty is a tax on investment. When businesses cannot predict what tariffs will exist next month or next year, they delay expansion, postpone hiring, and hoard capital. This creates a chilling effect across entire sectors of the economy. Manufacturing plants that might have been built are put on hold. Jobs that might have been created never materialize. Economic growth that could have lifted millions of families stagnates. And here's the cruelest irony of all. The industries that Trump's tariffs were supposedly designed to protect are among those suffering the most. American steel manufacturers initially celebrated the tariffs on imported steel, thinking they would gain market share and pricing power. But what actually happened? Their customers, American companies that use steel to manufacture cars, appliances, and construction materials, faced massive cost increases. Many of those companies responded by cutting production, laying off workers, or moving operations overseas entirely. The steel tariffs didn't revive American manufacturing. They accelerated its decline. The same pattern played out in agriculture. American farmers, particularly in the Midwest, export billions of dollars of goods to Canada every year. When Trump imposed tariffs, Canada retaliated with tariffs on American agricultural products. Suddenly, American farmers found themselves priced out of a market they had relied on for generations. Corn, soybeans, wheat, dairy products all faced retaliatory tariffs that made them uncompetitive. Trump's response was to offer government bailouts, billions of dollars in subsidies to compensate farmers for the markets his policies destroyed. This is not free market capitalism. This is a failed trade war propped up by government welfare. Let's zoom out and see the bigger picture. Trump's tariff war isn't just affecting Canada. He has simultaneously launched trade conflicts with China, Mexico, the European Union, and now even Brazil, where he recently imposed 50% tariffs on pharmaceutical imports. Each of these conflicts follows the same pattern: initial tariffs, retaliation, escalation, economic damage on both sides, and ultimately a worse position than where we started. This is not strategy. This is chaos masquerading as toughness. But the economic damage, as severe as it is, represents only half of the catastrophe. The other half is diplomatic, and it may prove even more consequential in the long term. Trump's treatment of Canada has fundamentally altered the relationship between the two nations in ways that will outlast his presidency and reshape the geopolitical landscape of North America. For over 150 years, the U.S.-Canada relationship has been defined by an implicit trust. This wasn't naive trust or sentimental friendship. It was strategic trust built on mutual interest, shared values, and demonstrated reliability. When threats emerged, whether in World War I, World War II, the Cold War, or the War on Terror, Canada and the United States stood together. The two militaries are integrated through NORAD, sharing responsibility for continental defense. Intelligence agencies cooperate so closely that they are essentially extensions of each other. The border between the two countries is famously undefended, a physical manifestation of the depth of that trust. Trump has taken this trust, and systematically destroyed it. He didn't do this with a single dramatic betrayal. He did it through a relentless accumulation of insults, threats, and transactional bullying. He imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum using a national security justification, effectively declaring that America's closest ally is a security threat. He threatened to tear up NAFTA entirely, holding the Canadian economy hostage in negotiations. He publicly humiliated Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, attacking him on Twitter after summits and undermining him on the world stage. And now he's gone even further, suggesting that Canada should simply surrender its sovereignty and become part of the United States. The response from Canada has been remarkable. Rather than capitulating, rather than desperately trying to appease Trump and restore the relationship, Canada has made a strategic decision to reduce its dependence on the United States. This isn't rhetoric, it's policy. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who replaced Trudeau after winning election on a platform of standing firm against Trump, Canada has accelerated a comprehensive trade diversification strategy. Canada is the only G7 nation with comprehensive free trade agreements spanning multiple continents. It has CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, which eliminates tariffs on 98% of goods. It is a leading member of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and other major Pacific economies. It has recently signed new trade agreements with Indonesia and is negotiating expanded partnerships with India, South Korea, and ASEAN nations. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is a fundamental restructuring of Canadian trade away from American dependence. Currently, approximately 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. That percentage is going to decline significantly over the next decade, not because Canada wants to harm the U.S. economy, but because Canada recognizes that relying so heavily on an unreliable partner is a strategic vulnerability that must be corrected. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand has publicly outlined Canada's three-pillar foreign policy strategy: defense and security, economic resilience, and core values. Economic resilience explicitly means reducing dependence on U.S. markets. Defense partnerships are being expanded with European and Pacific allies. Even in the Arctic, traditionally a domain of exclusive U.S.-Canada cooperation, Canada is now partnering with Australia and Nordic countries on security infrastructure. The psychological shift is equally profound. For generations, Canadians viewed their relationship with the United States as a source of stability and prosperity. There were always irritants and disagreements, but the fundamental partnership was never in doubt. That assumption is now dead. Poll after poll shows that Canadian trust in the United States has collapsed. 56% of Canadians have actively chosen to buy Canadian products over American ones in response to Trump's tariffs. Nearly 60% are deliberately avoiding American goods altogether. This isn't government policy.
Mark Carney has handled Trump's provocations with a diplomatic skill that makes the contrast even starker. When Trump suggested Canada become the 51st state, Carney calmly responded that the owners of Canada, the Canadian people, had already made their decision clear. When Trump claimed Canada was desperate for his missile defense system, Carney pointed out that, as a real estate developer, Trump should understand that some properties are simply not for sale. When Trump persisted, Carney replied with 5 firm nevers, delivering a masterclass in how to reject bullying without escalating into conflict. This diplomatic finesse has elevated Carney's stature internationally while diminishing Trump's. World leaders are watching this dynamic carefully. They see a Canadian Prime Minister who stands firm on principles, who represents his nation's sovereignty with dignity, and who refuses to be intimidated. And they see an American president who treats allies like enemies, who makes threats he cannot execute, and who fundamentally misunderstands the nature of power in the 21st century. Now, let's talk about what this means for real people, because behind every statistic, behind every trade flow and diplomatic statement, are human lives being fundamentally disrupted. Consider the American auto worker in Michigan. For decades, his job depended on a supply chain that moved seamlessly between Detroit and Ontario. Parts manufactured in Canada were assembled into vehicles in the United States, then sold across North America. This system worked because it was efficient, because it allowed American companies to compete globally by leveraging Canadian manufacturing capacity and expertise. Trump's tariffs have thrown this entire system into chaos. The auto company now faces unpredictable costs every time it orders parts from Canada. The uncertainty makes planning impossible. Investment decisions that would have created jobs are postponed indefinitely. And when the company finally decides it cannot manage the disruption anymore, what happens? It doesn't bring production back to the United States. It moves production to Mexico or China, where trade relationships are more stable and predictable. The Michigan worker loses his job, not because of free trade, but because of the chaos created by a trade war. Or consider the American family trying to build a home. Lumber prices have skyrocketed due to tariffs on Canadian wood. Canada supplies approximately 30% of the lumber used in U.S. construction. When Trump imposed tariffs, he didn't make American lumber mills magically appear. He just made building a home more expensive. A family that was on the edge of affording their first home is now priced out entirely. The American dream of homeownership, already increasingly unattainable due to rising costs and stagnant wages, is pushed even further out of reach.
On the Canadian side, the picture is more complex. Yes, Canadian exporters face costs from retaliatory tariffs. Yes, there is economic pain in sectors exposed to American markets. But there is also something else. A growing sense of resilience and independence. Canadians are discovering that they don't need America as much as they thought they did. They're finding new markets, new partnerships, and new opportunities. The short-term pain is creating long-term strategic advantages. Canadian steel manufacturers, for example, are redirecting exports to European and Asian markets. Canadian farmers are finding buyers in China and Southeast Asia. Canadian tech companies are expanding into European markets rather than focusing exclusively on U.S. expansion. This diversification makes Canada more resilient, less vulnerable to the whims of American politics, and ultimately more economically secure. But here's what's most striking. Canadians are not angry at America as a whole. They distinguish between Trump's policies and the American people. There is a recognition that millions of Americans are also victims of Trump's economic chaos. There is empathy for American workers losing jobs, for American families struggling with rising costs, for American communities devastated by factory closures. This nuance makes the contrast with Trump even sharper. Trump views international relations as a zero-sum game where America wins and everyone else loses. Canadians, by contrast, understand that prosperity is interconnected, that when your neighbor suffers, you suffer too, and that true strength comes from building partnerships rather than dominating rivals. The human cost extends beyond economics into the psychological and cultural realm. Canadians and Americans have always seen themselves as family, not just neighbors. Families on both sides of the border, cross-border friendships, cultural exchanges, shared history. All of this is being corroded by the current political environment. Young Canadians who once viewed America as a land of opportunity now see it as a source of instability and hostility. American border towns that relied on Canadian tourism and commerce are watching their economies wither as Canadians choose to vacation elsewhere. To fully grasp the magnitude of what is happening, we need to step back and view this moment in historical context. The U.S.-Canada partnership has been a cornerstone of American power for over a century. It provided secure borders, reliable resources, and a stable economic partner that allowed the United States to project power globally without worrying about its immediate neighborhood. This partnership was never charity. It was enlightened self-interest. By treating Canada as a genuine partner rather than a subordinate, the United States gained more than it could ever extract through coercion. Canada provided critical resources during World War II, fought alongside America in every major conflict, and served as a reliable ally in multilateral institutions. The economic integration created prosperity on both sides of the border and made North America one of the most competitive economic regions in the world. Trump's approach is reversing a century of strategic wisdom. By treating Canada as an adversary to be dominated rather than a partner to be respected, he is destroying one of America's greatest geopolitical assets, and nature abhors a vacuum. As the U.S.-Canada relationship deteriorates, other powers are moving to fill the space. China is already expanding its economic relationship with Canada. Chinese investment in Canadian resources, technology, and infrastructure has grown significantly. While Canada maintains concerns about Chinese influence and has blocked certain investments on national security grounds, the overall trajectory is toward deeper engagement. This doesn't mean Canada is becoming a Chinese ally, but it does mean Canada is diversifying away from exclusive dependence on the United States. The European Union is also deepening ties with Canada. CETA is just the beginning. There are discussions of expanded cooperation on defense, technology, and climate policy. Canada is increasingly viewed in European capitals as a more reliable partner than the United States, a perception that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Even within North America, the dynamics are shifting. Mexico, also targeted by Trump's tariffs, is exploring closer cooperation with Canada. The two nations are discussing bilateral agreements that would reduce their dependence on the United States. If this happens, if Canada and Mexico begin to cooperate more closely with each other than with the United States, the entire architecture of North American integration will have been fundamentally transformed. History teaches us that great powers don't usually fall through military defeat. They decline because they make strategic blunders that alienate allies, squander trust, and create openings for rivals. The British Empire didn't collapse because Britain was conquered. It collapsed because the costs of maintaining the empire exceeded the benefits, because colonized peoples demanded independence, and because Britain exhausted itself in conflicts that drained resources and political will. The United States is not collapsing, but it is making precisely the kinds of mistakes that erode great power status, alienating allies, prioritizing short-term transactional gains over long-term strategic relationships, treating partnerships as zero-sum competitions. These are the behaviors of a power in decline, not a power confident in its strength. Trump's rhetoric about making America great again rings hollow when his policies are systematically dismantling the foundations of American greatness. America's power was never rooted solely in military might or economic size. It was rooted in its ability to build alliances, create institutions, and offer a vision of prosperity that other nations wanted to join. Trump is squandering this inheritance for the sake of short-term political gains and personal ego gratification. The comparison to previous trade disasters is instructive. In 1930, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising tariffs on thousands of imported goods. The goal was to protect American farmers and manufacturers during the Great Depression. The result was catastrophic. Trading partners retaliated with their own tariffs. Global trade collapsed by over 60%. The Depression deepened and prolonged. Economists across the ideological spectrum now agree that Smoot-Hawley was one of the worst policy decisions in American history. Trump's trade war is following the same script. Tariffs imposed with promises of protection, retaliation from trading partners, escalation rather than resolution, economic damage spreading through the system, and political leaders, too, invested in the policy to admit failure and reverse course. But there's one crucial difference that makes the current situation even more dangerous. In 1930, the United States was the rising global power. It could afford mistakes because it had strategic depth and no serious rivals. In 2025, the United States is a mature power facing serious competitors. China's economy is approaching American size. The European Union, despite its internal challenges, remains a massive economic bloc. India is rising rapidly. The world is multipolar in a way it hasn't been since before World War II. In this environment, strategic mistakes have lasting consequences. Allies who walk away may not come back. Economic relationships that are severed may not be restored. Trust that is destroyed may never be rebuilt. Trump is conducting a high-stakes gamble with American power, and the early returns suggest he is losing badly. So, where does this leave us? The title of this analysis is not hyperbole. Trump's tariff war has backfired spectacularly, and Canada is indeed walking away from America. Not immediately, not completely, but the direction is unmistakable. Canada is systematically reducing its economic dependence on the United States, diversifying its partnerships, and building a foreign policy that no longer assumes automatic alignment with American interests. This is a historic shift with consequences that will outlast Trump's presidency. Even if a future American president tries to repair the relationship, even if tariffs are removed and diplomatic niceties are restored, the fundamental trust has been broken. Canada has learned that the United States is an unreliable partner, that American commitments can be discarded on a whim, and that Canadian prosperity cannot be built on a foundation of American goodwill. The economic costs are already being paid by American workers and American families. The strategic costs will compound over decades. And the responsibility lies squarely with a president who confused toughness with wisdom, who mistook domination for leadership, and who treated America's greatest continental partnership as just another transaction to be squeezed for short-term advantage. For ordinary Americans watching this unfold, the lesson is clear. You are the ones paying for Trump's tariff war. Your costs are rising, your job security is declining, your economic opportunities are narrowing, and while you struggle, the wealthiest Americans are reaping massive tax benefits that dwarf the costs they face from tariffs. This is the pattern we see again and again. Policies sold as protecting workers that actually enrich elites. Rhetoric about America first that actually puts American interests last. Promises of strength that deliver strategic weakness. Canada's departure from American economic orbit is not a bug in Trump's system. It's a feature. It's the predictable, inevitable result of treating allies like adversaries and partnerships like hostile takeovers. And if the United States continues down this path, Canada will not be the last ally to walk away. The world is watching. Trading partners are recalculating. Allies are hedging. And America's position at the center of the global economic system, the foundation of its prosperity and power for 75 years, is being deliberately dismantled by a president who doesn't understand what he's destroying. If this has made you reconsider what you've been told about trade wars, about economic nationalism, about what actually makes America strong, then share this analysis, because the mainstream narrative wants you to believe that tariffs are working, that tough talk equals tough policy, and that America can bully its way to prosperity. But the evidence tells a different story. Canada's response tells a different story. And your own economic experience, if you're honest about it, tells a different story too. This is not about politics. This is about reality. And reality, in the end, always wins.